Good morning, everyone. Um, can you hear me okay? Is my sound high enough? Okay, good. um, so I want to talk about practice, meditation practice, or any kind of practice, and in particular, I want to talk about effort, what it means to make effort, how sometimes in Zen teaching, we place a great deal of emphasis on things that you can't do anything about. So, enlightenment is something that you can't do anything about. Satori or Kensho, you can't bring them about. You can't make them happen. And yet we engage in different practices, whether it's sitting meditation or chanting or bowing or whatever, working on koans. And there's usually some intention or idea that we have that this is going to lead to something. And it does, in fact, lead to something. But it's a bit paradoxical how this works. But the paradox, or so in the Heart Sutra, it says there is no attainment and nothing to attain. But then almost immediately after that, it says all Buddhas attain Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. And so there can be a temptation to say, well, which is it? Is there no attainment and nothing to attain, or is there something to attain? When we say the four great vows, the last of the four great vows is the Buddha way is uncontrived. I vow to embody it fully. The Buddha way is uncontrived. I vow to embody it fully. So that's one translation. It's not a very literal translation, but it's okay. And the word uncontrived is very interesting because what does uncontrived mean? Something that is contrived means something that is done intentionally, and you're thinking about it while you're doing it, as opposed to something that just happens spontaneously. And while on the one hand, you cannot, you cannot do something spontaneously, because that's by definition not spontaneous, right? If you say, now I'm going to do this very spontaneously, you can't say I'm going to be uncontrived, although we say that in the four great vows, that we are striving to fully embody, or to attain, or to become, or to be something that is uncontrived. But really, if you've ever studied anything, part of the learning process for pretty much anything at all is repetitively doing something over and over again until it becomes natural. This is true for if you've ever watched, so I don't know how to knit, but if you've ever watched someone knitting, it's a kind of samadhi that they have to be in. And that samadhi comes from having learned how to do this with your hands over and over again until it becomes quite natural. Before the pandemic, my wife and I started taking ballroom dancing lessons. And at first, every move is contrived. Every move, you have to think about it. Oh, my foot goes here. I lean this way. But with practice, it becomes much more natural. When I took a physics course about 40 years ago, 40, 4 decades ago. And my professor, everybody, he was actually a pretty good teacher. Everybody hated him. They hated the class. He was actually a pretty good teacher, though. Very, very difficult class. and he would tell us, I'm going to explain to you how to solve all the different kinds of problems that you're supposed to learn how to solve. And you need, when I explain it to you and you're listening, what I'm explaining to you will be up here. He pointed to his his forehead, the what sometimes called the forebrain. And this is where we think, up here in this part of the head. And he said, but you have to listen to what I'm saying and retain it. And then as you're working, and then when you do your homework, then you'll have to think, oh, what kind of problem is this, and how is it solved? And then you'll think, and you'll say, oh yeah, and then you'll realize what kind of a problem it is. And then you come to the next problem in your homework, and you'll have to think, oh, what kind of problem is this, and how is it solved? And then you'll be able to call it up from your memory banks. And with practice, and he said, so if you have to do that on the test, you won't do very well. In your homework, if you do this over and over again, eventually you'll be able to just look at a problem and you'll know, oh, this is this kind of problem and this is how it's solved. And he said, and then he would turn his head and he would point to the back of his head. And now that understanding is back here. That's the reptilian part of your brain. And even though things that occur back here in the brain are reflexive, and they don't involve thinking. You do them automatically through repetition. What once required thought and contrivance has become natural. In language learning is another very good example of this. And right now, I'm studying Korean, which is a very difficult language. And I was looking at a YouTube video, a guy named Professor Yoon. He's got a bunch of really helpful YouTube videos on learning Korean. And it's Yoon is the name. He spells his name. And he's going over a very important part of Korean grammar. And he said, you have to become very familiar with this, because if you have to think about it, it's too complicated. So becoming familiar with it means you have to go over it over and over and over again. But then in language learning, there's this really interesting term that's used called fluency, right? You become fluent. If you have to think about how verbs are conjugated, if you have to think about how things are pronounced, then it's very unfluent. It's very contrived. But with practice, it becomes natural. One of the most important figures in the history of Buddhism was a Chinese teacher called Dahui. And Dahui, more or less, he didn't invent koans, but he kind of did. Or at least what he invented, or maybe other people came up with parts of it before Dahui. Maybe even other people, including Dahui's teacher, Yuan Wu. So Yuan Wu, I think I'm getting the names right, more or less. But Dahui put together things that other people had talked about and kind of gave it his own spin and popularized it. So that to this day, Zen students still study Dahui's writings. Interesting thing about Dahui, he lived during the Song dynasty in China about 800 years ago, and he was a very vocal proponent of treating men and women in Buddhism equally, including making women teachers. And his chief disciple was a woman, and he gave his chief dharma heir. He gave transmission to more than one person, but the first person he gave transmission to was a woman named Miao Tao, or her name is given differently in different sources, but no. Zen Master Sung San was a big fan of Dahui, and one of in addition to being a very vocal proponent of that women and men are both equally capable of studying Zen. This is, like I said, this is like in medieval China. He was also very active in teaching lay people, and so one of the forms in which Dahui's teachings have been preserved is in the form of letters that he wrote. He did a lot of correspondence with lay people, and he was one of the models that Zen Master Sung San used for his teaching style. And his teaching style also involved a lot of correspondence. This was before email. And now I'm not talking about the Song dynasty. I'm talking about like the 70s and the 80s, the 1970s, the 1980s. And that was how my teacher became Zen Master Sung San's student, was by writing him a letter. Zen Master Sung San would just say, and Zen Master Daihgak read an interview with Zen Master Sung San, in which Sung San said, "Anybody who wants to be my student can just write me a letter." And that's what Daihgak did, and that's how Zen Master Daihgak became Zen Master Sung San's student. And in part, that is due to the influence of Dahui and his style of teaching. But Dahui said that without effort you cannot understand. Um, and there's more than one ways of saying effort in Chinese, and the word that he chose is a very interesting Chinese word. It's a like many Chinese words, it involves two characters, and it takes the character for suffering, and it combines it with the character for mind. And so the word that Dahui used in this little teaching of his, without effort, there is no understanding. The word literally means suffering mind. And so I recently had a chance to talk to a friend of mine who's Korean, who I don't see very often at all. I hadn't seen her for over a year. And I was telling her that I was learning Korean now. And I said, and it's very, very difficult. And she said, of course, so since we're talking to each other, right? And my Korean is very, very, very lousy. So we're talking in English. And she said, oh, yeah, English is hard too. And she said she had to learn English for her job. And so when she was studying English, she said it was so hard, it almost made me cry. And I said, yes, exactly. I know what you mean. It's very difficult, this process of this effort, this suffering mind, which is a process of making something become natural, making something become uncontrived. But it only works. So whether it's knitting or uh, learning physics or learning a language, it only works if your mind has that innate capacity to learn this. So you are you're working with something that's already there. It's latent, it's innate, uh, but it requires great effort to bring it forth and to put it into practice. In um, in Tibetan, one of the words for meditation is uh, gom. Gom. I don't know. I can't pronounce Tibetan. But the reason why that word is interesting is because the literal meaning of gom in Tibetan is to become familiar with or to familiarize. And so when we meditate, when we do any kind of practice that we might call meditation, we are familiarizing ourselves with what? You know, when anybody first starts meditating, just doing silent sitting meditation, it's actually uh, not so easy to um, sit still, to not move, to not make any noises, to not look around. And with some practice, it becomes much easier. So we can see progress. Um, it's kind of nice to be able to see some sort of progress in one's practice. It can also be kind of elusive. Um, but really, and one of the things about uh, sitting meditation becoming easier with practice, one of the interesting things about that is that if you practice long enough, for decades, then as your body gets older, meditation doesn't get easier. So it's kind of good to, ideally, it's good to start young. There are plenty of examples of people who began serious practice even in their 60s or 70s. But but one way to, kind of an easy way to see this process of something becoming natural is in chanting practice. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the the Kanzeon chant, the 10-phrase Kanon Sutra, which goes. Let's see, I've got a little cheat sheet here. Even though, I mean, I've been doing this chant for many years. I can do it in my sleep. Literally, I have done it. I've woken up with this chant going through my mind. So it's, the title of the chant is the Enmei Juku Kanon Gyo. It goes, it says 10 phrases. Kanseon, Namu Butsu, Yo Butsu Uen, Yo Butsu Uen, Bupo Soen, Jo Rakugajo, Chonen Kanseon, Bonen Kanseon, Nennen Jushinki, Nennen Fudishen. And with a little effort, that can become completely natural. That can become something that you just can do, even in your sleep. But when you first try it, you have to think about each syllable. Like Professor Yoon said, you have to become familiar with it, because if you think about it, it's very complicated. And the Kanzeon chant is also considered a way of becoming familiar with our bodhisattva mind, of helping us not just to memorize those syllables, but all of those syllables point to the Buddha way. And we have the innate capacity to fully embody the Buddha way in a way that is uncontrived. But you can't make yourself do that. You can't just, you have to work at it. And if you work at it, if you familiarize yourself with it, if you do it over and over and over again, it becomes natural, more natural. Yeah, so I'll just end with one more repetition of the Kanzeon chant. Kanzeon, Namu Butsu, Yo Butsu Uen, Yo Butsu Uen, Bupo Soen, Jo Rakugajo Chonen, Kanzeon Bonen, Kanzeon, Nennen Jushinki, Nennen Fudishin. Thank you for listening.